This week's tale of the Old Trapper is titled Old Trapper and the Trip to the Big City by Shawn Henninger. The old trapper was sitting at his kitchen table relaxing when there was a knock on the door. The old trapper rarely had visitors, so it was a bit of a surprise. Looking outside, the old trapper saw a man wearing a blue outfit, and just behind him was a beautiful horse. On the side of the horse were the initials for the postal service. A mail delivery? Just for me, thought the old trapper. The old trapper opened the door and was greeted by a U.S. postal deliveryman. "I have a letter for a Mr. Old Trapper." The old trapper accepted the letter and invited the delivery man in for a cup of coffee. With deliveries that spanned miles, the mailmen of the old days would take time to rest before heading back on the trails. The old trapper made the mailman a cup of coffee and brought him a fresh muffin he had made that morning. The old trapper enjoyed the company, but the letter sitting near his pantry kept his attention. Who on earth would be sending me a letter? The mailman, feeling rested, thanked the old trapper for the hospitality and headed back on the trail. As soon as the old trapper was done waving goodbye, he rushed over to the letter and opened it up. The letter was from his cousin Joshua, who lived in the big city. In it, the old trapper's cousin let him know about all the things the big city had to offer and extended an invitation for the old trapper to come visit. The old trapper was so excited and put his plans together to visit Joshua in the big city. The old trapper wrote out a letter to Joshua explaining all the excitement that was happening at the old place and a date for when he'd come to the big city. The old trapper sealed up his letter and rode all the way to the local post office, which was a day's ride away. The letter was stamped and would reach his cousin in a matter of weeks or sometimes months, depending on how long it would take to get there. The old trapper counted down the days till he would make a trip to the train station and ride to the big city. The old trapper had rode a train or two in his day, but there was something about riding in a big machine that made the old trapper uneasy. Sure, you would get where you wanted quickly, but you missed out on all the sights on the way there. The day was here, and the old trapper rode his trusty old mule to the train station. As he approached the ticket counter, he could hear the loud train. There was a lot of smoke coming from the engine, and the old trapper thought more about the ride and realized he'd not be able to see any of the countryside. The old trapper decided he'd make this long journey on his trusty mule. Always being prepared, the old trapper already had everything he needed for a long journey. He had to make a few stops along the way, but was enjoying the beautiful countryside. Soon in the distance, he saw the big city. As he rode into town, he noticed that everyone in the big city dressed very differently than the old trapper. The old trapper was dressed in his best buckskin pants and buckskin jacket. He even wore his most prized raccoon hat. Soon the old trapper realized that the people in the big city were staring at him just as much as he was staring at them. The old trapper set his mule up in a stable and went to meet up with his cousin. As soon as they met, they shared a big hug and sat down at a table. The food in the big city was very different from what the old trapper was used to. They had odd things that the old trapper wasn't sure he even liked. The old trapper, ever prepared, decided to pull out his jerky and eat that instead of the odd sandwich his cousin had ordered. Again, the old trapper caught himself thinking how odd everything was in the big city, and again he felt kind of out of place. The old trapper's cousin's sandwich showed up, and it smelled delicious. It looked like something the old trapper could eat, but he'd already made a fuss about just eating his jerky. His cousin Joshua noticed the old trapper looking at his sandwich and offered a trade. Part of his sandwich for part of the old trapper's famous jerky. The old trapper was one of the best traders in all of the Mississippi Valley, but he wasn't so sure about this deal. The sandwich looked good, but it was different. But sometimes you just have to make the deal, and the old trapper shook cousin Joshua's hand and they traded. The sandwich was one of the most delicious things the old trapper has ever tasted. How has he never had something like this in his life? Cousin Joshua felt the same way about the jerky. Everyone in the city needs to try this, he said. The old trapper was hesitant, but he did bring more than enough to share. Soon, Cousin Joshua and the old trapper were meeting all kinds of people in the big city, trading jerky for different foods, clothing, and other goods that the old trapper had never seen before. Some things the old trapper really liked, and then others not so much, but it was all worth the experience. As the old trapper's trip was coming to a close, he gave his cousin a hug and told him he'd ship out some of his famous jerky to share with the people of the big city. The new friends that the old trapper met came to say goodbye as he began to ride out of town. Then the old trapper heard the train once more. As the surroundings whizzed by, the old trapper sat and enjoyed a delicious cup of coffee. After a little debate, the old trapper decided that he and the old mule could enjoy a nice ride back to the old place. He set up the old mule with a cabin of his own as he enjoyed a few more treats and company of some new friends. The old trapper was happy that he went to the big city. Even though some parts of the big city were scary, he was able to find a bunch of exciting things that he otherwise would have never seen or experienced. Plus, he was able to share a little bit of the old place with the city folk. The end. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales of the Old Trapper, written by Shawn Henninger. To support Tales of the Old Trapper, have your parents leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and follow Old Trapper Pod on Twitter. Be sure to share the Tales of the Old Trapper with others that would enjoy the adventure of the Old Trapper. Until next week, go out and create a tale of your own.